Hello, I'm Jennifer Keller, Programming Coordinator at the Westport Library. The library is pleased to be partnering with the League of Women Voters of Westport to welcome Julian Zelizer to the Westport Library community to discuss his book, Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of a Speaker and the Rise of the New Republican Party. Julian Zelizer is the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University, a CNN political analyst, and a contributor to NPR's Here and Now. He is also the author and editor of 19 books on American political history, including Taxing America, Wilbur D. Mills, Congress and the State, which was the winner of the Ellis Hawley Prize for the Best Book on Political History and the DB Prize for Best Book on Congress. What else do you need? He has received fellowships from the Brookings Institution, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, New America, and the New York Historical Society. With him tonight is Westport's own Bruce McGuirk, who has a background in government and theater, which, if you realize this, may mean the same thing. He is a lawyer with a penchant for reading well-written American history books and sharing them with our community in the book discussion group, Pages Through the Ages. If at any time you have questions for Julian, please type them in the Q&A tab and we'll get to as many as we have time for. And the webpage for purchasing a copy of Burning Down the House will stay live through 10 p.m. in case you'd like to buy a copy after this event. So without further ado, gentlemen, tell us more.
Thank you, Jennifer. Julian, you've written a terrific book. And if I may, would you please read the third paragraph on page 292 for us? I think it really wraps it up in a beautiful way.
Sure thing. And thank you. Thanks for all your kind words. It's nice to be with everyone. Too often we treat partisan polarization in our recent history as an inexorable force that nothing could stop. Because of the large-scale forces of history, the social scientists say voters have been sorted into red and blue states by the institutions remade to incentivize partisanship, and politicians can no longer find areas of agreement. But this view of polarization as inevitable denies agency to the politicians and leaders who pushed partisan combat into a deeper abyss at very specific moments. There were important points where American politics took a more destructive turn. There's a history of partisan polarization that we still need to tell. The battle over Speaker Wright in 1989 was one such turning point, a crucial event from which Washington never recovered.
Thank you. Now, Julian, that is a mouthful, but you do an excellent job proving it in the book. Could you give us, just lay the groundwork? Say it's 1980, you've just been elected to Congress as a Republican. What are your expectations now? What is your future?
Well, one expectation for any Republican member of Congress was that you would be in the minority, certainly in the House of Representatives. Democrats had generally controlled all of Congress, really since 1932, with two exceptions. And the House of Representatives was a bastion of Democratic power. So most Republicans assumed they would be the minority power. They would exert influence by working with Democrats, by trying to negotiate on legislation, by working in the committee system, which was very important at that time, even more important than the party leaders. And most Republicans, not all, but most in the leadership in 1980, 1981, still believed that in addition to partisanship, the health of political institutions mattered, and also that governance mattered, that the objective of being in politics was to pass things, to make policy. And that was the mindset of most Republicans when the Reagan era began.
Okay, I love the line that you quote from the Wall Street Journal. Washington was as used to the Washington Republicans as they were used to the Washington Generals, which was the fictitious basketball team the Harlem Globetrotters always killed. Now tell us about the Democrats in that makeup. Were they always meeting the standard of perfect governance, or had they just turned into a big complacent mob?
Well, Democrats, in 1980, they were nervous. They were fearful because Ronald Reagan won the presidency, and the Senate, for the first time, turns to the Republicans. That will end within 6 years. But there's this moment where Democrats who have been in power, who had gotten used to power on Capitol Hill, were leery about what was coming. And many were worried the New Deal, the Great Society programs, all these key landmark pieces of legislation, would they endure through the 1980s? Democrats had reformed Congress after Vietnam and Watergate. A younger generation had come in, people like Henry Waxman of California, and they created sunshine rules to open more of Congress to the public. They had created ethics rules that limited what a member could or could not earn, but it had been imperfect. There were limits to how much reform they enacted. And so I think they were operating in a system that was filled with vulnerabilities and problems. And what they wanted most, though, in the 80s was simply to survive Ronald Reagan.
And even though Watergate had happened and the reverberations from that are still to be felt, it's the Democrats who are nervous in one way because all of the reform acts are taking place. They apply to them as much as they apply to anybody. And on the outside, we have do-gooder organizations such as Common Cause, which we all recall and which had a lot of clout and respectability. Right?
That's exactly, that's exactly right. I mean, the story of the 70s was this group of young Democrats, primarily younger Democrats, who came in the aftermath of these, tumultuous events capped off by Watergate, and believed that government had to be better. They believed in reforming the system. And then groups like Common Cause, who were often allied with them, who also believed that the process mattered as much as the outcome. And if you were around Washington in the early mid-70s, as all of this was happening, most Democrats assumed this would favor the Democrats. The idea was, in their mind, America was a pretty liberal country. And what had stifled liberalism was this broken Washington, where old Southern Democrats teamed up with Republicans and corrupt presidents stopped progress on a lot of issues. But what they didn't anticipate was those reforms could be used against them. And that even a more partisan Washington might actually not necessarily be in their favor.
And the press also loves this. It is serving up sound bites, La Palooza, every single day that they can use on their new expanded news coverage over and over. And you see every reporter walking around Washington wanting to be a new Carl Bernstein, wanting to be a new Watergate baby and discover the new scandal. So everything is charged.
Yeah, this is an insight that Newt Gingrich, who's the focus of this story, understood pretty well. There was really two changes in the media. One was in the 70s, the rise of investigative journalists who all wanted to, often genuinely, find out if there was corruption and to uncover the relationship between money and politics and lobbyists and to serve as a perpetual watchdog on government. And the second change is really accelerating in the 80s. It's not simply the importance of television to political news, but cable television, C-SPAN, CNN, all these channels are coming into the landscape and changing the tempo of news, increasing the ability of politicians to speak directly to voters without reporters kind of being in the middle. And those are two changes that are as important as the reforms we just discussed.
Right. And into this all steps Newton Leroy Gingrich, just a country boy from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Any red flags in his background? a childhood zookeeper. His favorite pet is a snake. Anything like
Well,
that?
that could be an insight. I mean, we do know from early on he was always very ambitious, and
Yes.
I have a story in the book where there's no zoo in Harrisburg, which is where his family was from, even though he ends up in Atlanta ultimately. And he goes to the government as a young boy and literally tries to lobby for a zoo to be built. And the snake is one story, but that story gives you a sense of the ambition of this guy. And it's the same. He runs for a position in high school government and shows already in high school in Atlanta the same kind of determination that you will see from him later on. He has a rough childhood. I mean, that's another red flag. His biological father leaves his mother a few days after they get married while she's pregnant. He doesn't have a relationship with him. He has a stepfather who takes care of him, raises him. He's in the military, but he's extraordinarily tough with him, not loving, very firm, very kind of invested in making him a man, quote unquote. And I think some of the upbringing and the roughness of the family ultimately shapes his character. And also one other story, but something is a red flag. In high school, he ends up dating his high school teacher, who he'll marry. This is his first wife. And he has a rebellious side right off the bat. His stepfather does not want this to happen, thinks it's horrible, but he doesn't care and he persists and kind of shows an anti-authority mentality from a young age that would continue throughout his life.
And the anti-authority would be a driving force through his career. Also that he just wants to be a contrarian. You mentioned how when he was in college, while the rest of us are, I don't know, reading maybe Marx and Lenin, or at least Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, he's fascinated by von Clausewitz. Who the hell reads von Clausewitz when they're in college? For any viewer that doesn't know the Prussian lord, that's all. Politics is merely an extension of warfare, and warfare is the true calling of man. Win at all costs, which is just something I see Gingrich jumping into.
Yeah, I mean that is he spends, but before he ends up in the Atlanta area, he's in Europe, and one of the trips that makes the most impression on him is visiting with his family World War I site.
Yes.
Where you can still see the remains, and he at least talks about starting to see life in this kind of black and white prism and seeing warfare really as a defining element of all things. And this continues with him. And in college, and in graduate school, he goes to get his PhD in Tulane. He becomes, really focused on the convergence of these two worlds. He's uninterested in the counterculture, doesn't care about rock and roll. He loves politics, and he sees politics through that kind of militaristic lens. And by the early 70s, even the first time he runs, he's very much a believer already, and it will intensify in the idea that politics can't be about doing nice things. It can't be about following norms. It really is about destruction, total destruction of your opponent.
Can you tell us a little bit about his academic career before we get to Congress? Now, tell us about Brussels and how badly the Belgians handled their colonial empire, according to Newt.
Yeah, he writes his dissertation on colonialism, and this is the late 60s, early 70s. And his point is not to critique colonialism as a policy, but to say that the Belgian that did it the wrong way. That they didn't really understand how to cultivate an elite that would be loyal to the hosts, essentially. And so just the dissertation itself gives you a flavor that in this early period, when he's still a Nixonite, he's kind of a moderate Republican, he's starting to go against main currents in American politics. On the other hand, he's very much counterculture in that everything we're describing, even though it's coming from a more conservative point of view, is about challenging authority, challenging norms. And there's ways in which I think he actually embraces some of the 1960s for very different purposes. He's also, the other part of his academic career I write about is it doesn't work very well. He gets a job as a professor right out of graduate school, but he hates it. The first years, he applies to be president of the university, to be the department chair. He wants to instantly kind of go to leadership, and he doesn't understand why no one wants to do this. So that's why by 74, he's not publishing anything, and he's already eyeing a career in politics.
Okay, and he's rather persistent at that. He loses twice. And I'm sorry, there was the old Georgian congressman that he lost to.
Jack Flint, an old Southern Democrat.
Old Southern Democrat from the old mold. And then he wins against a woman that jumps in as the Democratic nominee. And he pulls off a rather amazing trick there, which I thought was really nasty, but about where she was going to live.
Yes. So the third time he runs in 78, the Flint had retired, and so it's an open seat. And she's a moderate Democrat, actually. Some say she's in some ways more conservative than him, which isn't unusual in the South at this point. You had a lineup of Democrats and Republicans that don't really match where we are today. And he instantly shows what he's willing to do. And one of the things he does is she's married and her husband works in the district. And she says if she wins, her family would probably stay there in the Atlanta area so that he could continue his work. The kids could be there and she'd go back and forth. And it's almost an instinct he has. He pounces on this and starts to say that she's an anti-family Democrat, that she's willing to destroy her family for pursuit of professional interests. I saw the kind of local papers and all his campaign stops, he's surrounded by his family, which behind the scenes is falling apart as this is happening, but no one knew this. And her campaign, she's furious with this because the Democrats feel this was just lowball politics and totally misconstruing what she said, but he wins. And by 1979, he's in Washington.
Which brings me to the thing I can just not get over is his use of chutzpah. He just says, yeah, I did it. Now let's talk about the other side. And for some reason, I think we know a few things. None of this sticks to him. He can be as hypocritical as he wants to be, but the doors always stay open. There's a Mother Jones article, and I'm not sure what campaign this is published in, but it is devastating. It tears him apart. He interviews, the Mother Jones reporter interviews a number of people that have worked with him. They all have bad things to say about him. And I think, is this the story in which broke that he went to see his first wife in the hospital to discuss divorce while she is undergoing cancer treatment?
Right. So this article, I interviewed the author who did that, and it was really scathing. Mother Jones was a liberal left-wing magazine, but it was a portrait which the author originally just wanted to understand who this young Republican who was considered kind of a McCarthyite in the early 80s, who he was. And what became clear as he reported it was most people who knew him didn't like him very much, even loyal staffers. He was mean. That story is in the article, that he discusses divorce while his wife's in the hospital for cancer. There's all sorts of other stories about his sexual exploits. And it's very much at odds with this guy who's positioned himself with the new conservative movement where evangelical Christians are important, talking about morality. It's clear his life is not that. And the article also kind of suggests ethical shadiness of who he is when he's making ethics the big issue. And so it was a real X-ray early on into who he was as a person, but it doesn't really affect him at all. In fact, it's published right as his rise to power is going to take off the following year. And I don't know if chutzpah is the right word, but throughout his career, each time this kind of thing happened, he had an ability, certainly in the 80s and early 90s. I mean, ultimately, he'll lose his speakership. He had an ability to kind of drive through these moments of scandal to reshape the narrative and present it as a problem with the person making the accusations rather than him, and simply not care about hypocrisy. There's a level where I don't know if he cares or not, but he certainly doesn't display any caring about doing what he's accusing others of doing. And it served him well politically. He really survives many of these moments that brought down his own opponents.
Okay, now he goes after a few people. And then we come to Speaker Wright. You name him in the book as the perfect foil. Tell us a little about him and why is he the perfect foil for Newt?
So Gingrich's whole strategy really by the mid 80s is not to talk so much about conservative versus liberal, so much as establishment versus anti-establishment rhetoric, which today is familiar. And the whole idea was to paint the Democratic majority of Congress as fundamentally corrupt, that they kept their power not because they were popular, but because they used all the rules of politics to their advantage. And the speaker before Jim Wright had been Tip O'Neill, and he tried this with Tip O'Neill, but it didn't work. Tip O'Neill proved to be very popular. The public liked him. He appears on the show Cheers, which was a hit show in the 1980s, and none of it really sticks. Wright takes over after O'Neill resigns. And Wright is, he's kind of an old school politician. He's not corrupt, but he definitely goes to the border of what's shady in politics. He doesn't kind of live by the rules of post-Watergate. He does what all legislators had done and many still did. For example, one of the stories in the book is in the 70s, Congress put limits on how much members of Congress could make speaking. So you get an honoraria when you speak. You could make so much and that was it. But Congress didn't limit how much you could earn if you published a book. And so Wright published a book and he earned a lot of money and he sold it in bulk to groups. There was nothing unethical about it, nothing illegal, but it didn't look good. And Wright was also someone who didn't like the media. He was happy not to appear in front of reporters. He liked the old closed rooms of politics. He didn't really get how politics had changed. And finally, he was someone who was respected. He was very skillful as a party leader, but he wasn't liked. Most people, Democrats, they didn't like him. They didn't dislike him the way they dislike Gingrich, but he wasn't a warm person. He was very cold. And so he lived in this world on Capitol Hill where there wasn't intense loyalty to him as a person. So all three of those combine and make him a perfect foil for Gingrich to say, look, Democrats are as corrupt as I'm saying. Look at who their leader is.
One of the things that really was brought home to me by your book is just in terms of civic knowledge. We don't really take the speakership as seriously as we should just in terms of discussing politics generally. Wright is there. Tip O'Neill was right before him. We have other speakers like Sam Rayburn is in living memory. Great, powerful people. Do you think Wright lived up to that? Or, I mean, was he competent enough as a speaker or not? Well,
I mean, if the measure is how long one survives, not is the answer, meaning, you know, his term starts in 87 and in May of 1989, he's forced to resign or he's pressured to resign. So longevity matters. Can you survive the vicissitudes of politics is one measure of a speaker. He was skillful in other ways. I mean, between 1987 and 89, part of what you start to really see is a pushback against the Reagan Revolution. And Democrats start to check Reagan on a lot of his domestic agenda on foreign policy in Central America, which is really a hotbed in that decade. Wright orchestrates a peace deal on his own with the players involved in Nicaragua. And on that level, you could see why some thought he could be a very good speaker. And even though Democrats didn't like him, they followed him. He knew how to whip up the vote, as they say on Capitol Hill. And so he had the makings for it. But I think ultimately, in my mind, he didn't see where politics was going. He didn't understand the nature of television. He didn't understand the nature of partisan warfare. He didn't totally understand how the Republican Party was changing. He thought Gingrich was an outlier. What he didn't get was Gingrich was the future. And so his failure ultimately is the inability to totally grasp that. And so in the end, he wasn't a Sam Rayburn, he wasn't a Tip O'Neill, and he barely survived.
Okay, and Newt Gingrich is still going to go after him, even though the accusations he may have against him are either thin or they're not really well sourced. You mentioned he has a binder of newspaper clippings that all give some stories, but a lot of innuendo against Wright. And you have a beautiful scene in the book where he's talking to, I believe, the head of his staff, where he says, I'm going to file an ethics complaint with the ethics committee against Speaker Wright. And she is like, you can't do that. That's unprecedented. And he says, well, he compares himself to Martin Luther and even says, here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. Which just made me shake. So he's going forward. What do you think of the charges he actually brought up? Was there anything there, or was it all in his words, heat and noise? And if you generate enough, you get in the papers.
Yeah, I mean, it was really the accusations he brought were very flimsy. And again, no one ever, even the ethics committee, will not find ethical violations. They'll just find someone who didn't think through how things might look. But the two main ones were this book sales, which again, many members, you were allowed to do it. It didn't mean it was good, but it didn't mean you had to not be speaker for it. Gingrich himself had a whole book deal as this was going on. That was it was much more shady than what Wright had done. And Wright has a relationship with a business, which was legal, with a real estate developer in Fort Worth, which is his district. And this is another story. Gingrich he's great at shaping a story that it was really untoward, and this lobbyist was essentially manipulating Wright. And no one ever found proof of that. Again, everything was by the law, but it didn't look good. And both of those stories, these were not worthy of bringing a speaker down. But boy, did Gingrich understand how to whip up a frenzy about both of them and make them look worse than Watergate. Really kind of, that was the impression you had by the time he resigned. And Democrats by 1989 with these stories are feeling like they have to do something, or Wright is going to hurt them and cost them their majority.
Okay, so we're right on the balance here. And then this almost made me fall out of my chair. Right out of left field comes a story about John Paul Mack. Can you give us that too? Can you give us that, please?
Yeah, it's a horrible, shocking story. And John Mack was one of the most powerful staffers on Capitol Hill. He was essentially Wright's right-hand man. It was the kind of person that when he came to speak to a member, you felt that the speaker was talking and you listened to what he had to say. And a story breaks in May of 1989, as we're reaching the climactic moment of the ethics committee looking into all these charges that Wright had spoken about, that John Mack had a really horrible incident in his, a violent attack in his background. Back in 1973, he had violently attacked a woman when he was working as a store clerk. And basically, she wanted to return something. He said to come to the back of the store, and he attacked her with a hammer. He beat her to the point she almost died. She didn't. She would have multiple surgeries to recover. And the story goes, he went to jail, but for a very short period. He's released, and his brother is married to one of Wright's daughters. So there's a connection there. And he gets a job working on Capitol Hill in Wright's office and gradually moves up the ladder. And there had been stories about this. It was not totally unknown, but no one knew the details. And usually people thought he had been in jail, he had been rehabilitated, which was a big, an important idea of the time. And he had served his time and worked his way up. But this story that comes out in the Washington Post in the style section is very vivid. And it's written from the perspective of the woman who was attacked. And it's beyond shocking to read. I remember when I first encountered it, I didn't know that as I started it. And the story politically is a disaster. Wright doesn't deny it. He said he didn't know all the details about what he had done, and that the prison guards and staff had said he had been rehabilitated. But that is really devastating, because many Democrats, when this story comes out, are like, how can he have this person working for him? Some female legislators like Pat Schroeder publicly say this is too much. It's time, certainly for Mack to resign, but it might be the end of Wright. And again, it's not connected to anything Gingrich had ever talked about, nor is it connected to the ethics issues, but politically, it's unbelievable. It reflects the culture, one last thing, of Washington. These were just not issues taken seriously at the time. And I think you see the disconnect between the world of the 80s and where we are today.
It's a horrible story. So this basically removes any possibility that this is going to be turned around. Wright has to resign. I love the story you tell of a group of congressmen needing to go to tell Wright it's over, and one tells the other, no, you go, and then he tells another congressman, no, you go. And then finally, the congressman that does go in tells him this, that he's lost his support. And Wright, other than turning red, takes off one of his shoes very carefully and hurls it at the congressman's head, who then ducks out of the room. So Wright gives himself the opportunity of having a farewell address to the House. Everyone's there, everyone sits, and he makes what appears to be, although he's certainly no TV star, a pretty good defense on the ethics charges. And while he's doing this, and he is getting the applause and he's getting the standing ovations, some certainly out of courtesy, Newt Gingrich is there, and he's scribbling along on a pad. Could you tell us how you came across those notes, please?
Yeah, and just to kind of, just two things before I get to the notes. One is that no speaker had resigned until that point in American history. And now we've had several who've been in trouble in different ways, including Gingrich. And so it was an enormous moment that this was happening for the party and for the institution. And the speech itself, you can see it on YouTube. People should Google it. It's 1 hour. It's considered really a great piece of oratory. And he goes by each charge specifically. It's very technical, but to say why it's not true. And he admits in the speech, I had bad judgment. I didn't always kind of think of how things might look, but he goes through everything to show he never violated an ethics rule. And he means it, because this is a guy who loves politics. He loves Washington. And he ends the speech by saying to the Gingriches, he doesn't use his name, to basically lay down your arms. He says, I didn't do anything, but I'm giving myself up so you can stop. And he tells his own party, don't get back at Gingrich. Don't go back and forth, because he says we will enter a period of mindless cannibalism. And that's the end of the speech. And he obviously didn't see where things were going. But the pad of paper I found in the archives, which These are the papers of Newt Gingrich, which are in West Georgia College. It's a kind of yellow pad of paper with scribbled notes. And it's really an amazing piece of paper where Gingrich is expressing in written form his fury that somehow Wright isn't taking culpability. He's blaming him, and he's kind of blaming a partisan system rather than saying he had violated ethics rules. But it ends, and I don't have the exact words that's in the book. I don't remember right now. But the gist of the last little line he wrote was, but since he's talking about me, it shows I've made it, which captured the whole thing. But the notes, so when you go to these archives, for people who haven't been to one, and most people haven't, there are these huge boxes of kind of file folders with papers. And the Gingrich, most papers of members of Congress are not useful. They're letters between constituents and members, and that's about it, or reprints of speeches. Gingrich had actually an amazing collection, and this document was what you find occasionally. It was a piece of paper stuck in between two folders in a box that no one had ever seen. And I was just going through this, I remember one day, and I found it, I started looking at it, and there you have, Gingrich, once I saw what it was, Gingrich's on the spot reaction to the culmination of this story that I was going to tell. So it was really one of those amazing archival finds that you can't anticipate.
With this incident, can you draw a direct line, or do you draw a direct line from this sort of political warfare, the mindless cannibalism, to the age of Trump?
I mean, I do. I think this story is important for that line. Gingrich, this was one among many attacks that he launched, and this was his style, to not only attack your opponent, but to try to end their career, to try to destroy their reputation. And I'll get to the answer. In 1994, I found this other incredible letter where Gingrich became speaker, and Wright sends him a letter, a very heartfelt letter, where he says he wishes him well. He says, "I never forgive you for making me look like a criminal in front of the public. And it was not right. It was not fair," he said, "and you destroyed my image." But he sends a letter, will say, "But I'll put it aside and do well as speaker." And that was how Gingrich thought of politics. And the Wright story in 1989 does two things. One, it's successful. Gingrich brings down the speaker. And so for Republicans, even moderates who are thirsty for power, even if you didn't like what Gingrich was doing, it looked like there was something to it. And B, during this whole process, Republicans elect him to be something called minority whip, which is part of the leadership team of the Republican Party. And it's because of what he's doing to Wright. And what that does is it puts this smash mouth style of partisanship, it moves it from being on the sidelines and by a maverick into being part of the leadership of the party. And then Gingrich is elected in 94, and he brings that style to the highest levels of congressional power. And then I think the Tea Party under Obama is really just a second generation, more aggressive than he was, but that follows that idea that partisanship should have no limits, and that there was a logic to doing whatever was necessary to maintain power rhetorically, procedurally, strategically. And I think Donald Trump, in many ways, as president, was really the culmination of that. And that's why the Gingrich story is so important. You see where this style is not only introduced in Washington, but it gains legitimacy in a party, and it kind of never went back after that.
Do you see the Republicans, since this occurred, continuously acting like a minority party, even if they are in control, just in terms of attack, dig up a scandal, behead, usurp, repeat? Yeah,
I mean, if you listen to a lot of Republican leaders, you'll think they're always out of power. I mean, it's almost as if they're drawing on what Gingrich was telling Republicans back in 81 and 82 when they didn't have power in the House. But even when they've had the presidency, the Senate, and the House, they continue to use that. And the idea is you create a foil and you use your opponent and kind of explain them as unfairly, viciously, autocratically attacking you in whatever realm. And I think that rhetoric remains quite integral, and it's different. I think the parties are different. This is much more integral in many ways to Republican political rhetoric.
And you got to make sure you repeat certain concepts. Socialism, crisis. He says at one point that the ethics affecting right is an ethics crisis that threatens the freedom and liberty of every American. Now,
right.
So I get the impression Gingrich actually believed this. Did you see anything in those records which there's got to be a lot there, and there's some weird stuff too. We were talking about it before the show. That just, is there anything there that would indicate he knows he's putting on a show, or is everything 100% sincere?
I think it's all of the above, meaning, and it's hard. It's really hard to decipher. There are moments he's talking about the Democrats ever since then, but certainly at that period, where he seems to genuinely believe this is what the Democratic Party is about, and the kinds of ethics problems he's talking about, again, which weren't formally ethics problems, but these gray areas were so severe that they threatened our democracy. That said, he never lived by those rules. So if he was someone who really cared about this and really believed it, you would think he would want to clean up his own house, and he'd want to clean up the Republican House ethically. But that never happens. It's never part of the Republican agenda. In fact, when he's Speaker, this is when the Republicans perfect what's called the K Street connection and manufacture through him and Tom DeLay a system of rotating staffers between lobbying organizations and Capitol Hill positions, which is quintessentially unethical if you're kind of taking this stuff seriously. Gingrich is fined for ethics violations in 1997, first speaker to face that. And so he doesn't live by the code he's talking about, which makes me suspicious that even though he sounds like he believes it, it seems a little thin. And I talked to someone who was involved with Common Cause, who he thought of it as situational ethics, he called it, that he did care about it, but only if it was politically convenient. Otherwise, he couldn't care less. And that's why some of these reform groups who actually become involved in the right investigation, they feel they have to at least see if there's something there. They don't like Gingrich at all. They don't think he's on board with any of this. He's just using it politically. He's weaponizing it.
Okay, now my time is almost done. You have very skillfully put this together and focused on this one incident as an indication of where things are going. This is a huge signpost in American history. Are you going to write the rest of the story? Because there's a lot there.
It's a fair question. I'll have to see. My next book comes out in October.
Oh, what's that?
And totally different. It's about a rabbi named Abraham Heschel, who was a civil rights and anti-war.
Okay.
Yes. So I've shifted, and part of me right now feels like I wanted to look for more inspirational figures and to look for a different element of politics. But we'll see. I've come back. I don't know if I'll finish on Gingrich, a kind of multi-biography of him, but I'll certainly come back to some of the themes. But for the time being, I've moved into the realm of religion and politics back in the 60s.
Well, whatever you write, I'm there for you.
Thank you.
Jennifer's going to jump in at any moment. We've got some questions here. If I could just ask, Jennifer, you're there.
That's okay, Bruce. Finish your question.
Okay, this is from a very important participant. So, is the failure of Gingrich's personal, extraordinary, ethical lapses to tarnish him as a result of the political incompetence of his Democratic opponent, or the voting public's underlying conviction that it really didn't matter so long as he was right on issues relating to race, abortion, and small government, even if only by reason of lip service. In other words, he won. He was successful here. Is that going to carry over everything he did, which was wrong?
I think it matters. I mean, it matters in that my book, it's funny. I mean, a lot of the book and the way it was reviewed and read, not incorrectly, was about the damage that this style of partisanship ultimately was inflicting on American politics, and a template of a dangerous kind of partisanship that went well beyond what we had and normalized some of these tactics. But he was a very shrewd politician, and I wanted to convey that. He really was an entrepreneur, whether you like him or not, who understood where we were in American history and understood how the media worked. Boy, was he good at television, and he understood the rhythm of television. And it wasn't simply that Wright was incompetent, though I do think he didn't understand how to fight back. And I do think Democrats were not totally able to stop this, but I don't want to undersell what he and many Republicans after were able to do in understanding where we were in this era. So he deserves credit for his success, not for the outcome, for what he did that goes well beyond just the failure of his opponents. In terms of his support, I don't know. I mean, look, there's one school that says that's exactly what this is about, that you have a very partisan mentality in the GOP, more than the Democrats right now, meaning anything is permissible if you get your goals. So you can have a president who doesn't live the life of the moral majority, but if that president will deliver Supreme Court picks and federal court picks, so be it. And I don't know. I don't know kind of what's in the heart of the support, but yes, in the end, the one thing he did deliver, even with his own downfall, was victory. He helped to make an era where Republicans were in power for many years in Congress, where they were influential and where they were forced to be reckoned with. And I think ultimately a lot of Republicans appreciate that, and they don't care about the rest.
And maybe the party in control should be a little bit nicer to the minority so they don't get as much of a backlash when these things go south, or however you want to put it. Another question.
let me just jump in on that. That's a really good point, actually. And this is a book without heroes, meaning I don't want to paint the Democrats as virtuous. And part of my argument is it was such a flawed political system that there was a lot of ways to attack Wright, whether it was him or just the Democrats, for money in politics and lobbying and the ways in which it worked. And the other thing that really angered Republicans was what you said, that Democrats had often excluded them from decision making. They had been pretty rough with them. And Gingrich used that, because there were Republicans like Olympia Snowe, who's a moderate, who I say in the book votes for him to be in the leadership, not because they like him and not because they even like his tactics, but they're so sick of being excluded. And Wright himself, I interviewed him for many hours. He himself told me that was, I asked kind of about regrets, and he said he didn't totally understand how a strong Democratic majority and the tactics they often use to try to contain the Republicans generated this animosity in the GOP, which someone like Gingrich could easily capitalize on.
Okay, another question. You'll like this, it's religious. Given Gingrich's ability to ignore the open hypocrisy of his own life and conduct while he pursued those allegedly of others, would it be fair to say that he was John the Baptist to Donald Trump's Messiah to the hard right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that comparison, I start the book when, it's a little different, but I start the book when Gingrich is being considered as one of Trump's vice presidential picks in 2016. Ultimately, it goes to Pence. But one of the things Gingrich says is on TV, as he's trying to get the job, is he says in a positive way, he and Trump are very much alike. They're both pirates. And then he admits it might be too much to have two pirates on a ticket. But I think the disconnect between the personal conduct and personal life and their role in a party that, at least on paper, is against all those things is very similar. I think in some ways, President Trump took it to new levels and was even more brazen about it. I mean, Gingrich still was in the era you hid these things. Or if they came out, he kind of denied it or pushed it aside, where Trump, you can see the acceleration of these hypocritical elements. He just, yes, those were the Access Hollywood tapes. Okay, that's what I say. And that's the intensification of that mentality. But I think the question is a fair one, and I think that is an important similarity.
Yeah, and supreme confidence of being able to do that.
Yes. Yes, in part because of both in different periods knew or had a very good feel for the media in terms of how to respond to these kinds of issues as they emerged, how to almost distract the media. Gingrich would do it with C-SPAN and Trump would do it with Twitter, but they understood that really well. And so when these issues emerge, part of the reason they're not as scared is they, unlike their opponents, they can move everyone on. And I think both of them did that because of their real keen understanding of the media environment.
This is something I was thinking about today. Partisanship in American politics is nothing new. Going back to the earliest days of a democracy, John Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, not to mention the decades leading up to the Civil War. How is that different from today? Do you really think it is worse today?
Yeah, it's a fair question. And I'd say of all the questions, this is one I've kind of tackled often in different ways, but it gets to the heart of what we're talking about. I think, yes, there are other periods where partisanship has become so intense it's almost dysfunctional. And the Civil War and the period leading up to the Civil War is the most obvious comparison. Another where divisiveness is really intense is the 60s. Doesn't mean this is good because we've had other bad periods. It means this is another moment of bad. I think one difference, though, is this is now totally normalized. It's not episodic. It's not about a single issue. It's not about a moment. And partisanship, meaning the divide that we have between red and blue, it now affects every element of politics. There are even routine decisions like passing a budget or putting on a face mask. Everything becomes part of this. And that's different than some of those other periods in my mind. And part of the effect of that is that a lot of our basic processes, like the filibuster, like the budget process, they are now totally enmeshed in partisan politics to the point they're not even very functional. And so I think that's another difference. And I do think, I talk about this and there's differences, but I think the extremism you're seeing in the GOP really in the last few decades, it's not simply partisanship. It's one of the parties has moved very, very far off center in terms of ideas and tactics. That's also different. But it doesn't mean we haven't had other periods. It doesn't mean we can't survive this period. But we shouldn't discount how deep this kind of partisanship now is in the body politic.
Okay, one more, and this is very short, but the implications are broad. Why did Gingrich own Caucus turn against him and oppose him? And on to that, did they really decide that they wanted to get rid of him because they had no more use for his tactics? Or was it simply a convenient thing at the time? What do you think?
Yeah, so he becomes speaker in 1995. Republicans took over in 94, and he's forced to step down at the end of 1998. It is not that Republicans, the caucus, start to say his tactics are unsavory and not kind of part of what they should be doing. There's two very specific reasons they force him to step down. One is Republicans do poorly in the 1998 midterms. They don't lose control of the House, but they lose seats, which isn't traditional. And it takes place as President Clinton is being impeached. And many Republicans are furious. They say, well, kind of what's going on here that Gingrich is really blowing it. And whatever the tactics he's using didn't pay off. And B, he at the time is having another affair. And this is when Republicans are impeaching President Clinton for lying about an affair. And many Republicans just said that really doesn't work for us right now. It's not very good public relations if you're doing it. And for those two reasons, he steps down, or he's pressured into stepping down. It's not about style. It's not about partisan tactics. It's about him. He's no longer needed and he's no longer useful. And ultimately, I'll conclude by he created that world. He created a world where leaders could be brought down very quickly and careers could end in a heartbeat. And so it's, I guess, a little Shakespearean that he would be 4 years into his speakership kicked out because he was no longer serving the party purpose anymore either.
Okay, Jennifer, come on. I have one more question very quick.
Okay, one more question.
All right. Does character matter?
It should matter. And I've studied many other periods and leaders, and I do think it's important in politics. I mean, I think we discount that. We're so cynical in some ways, but the character of a leader has great impact on how they govern and what they do with their power. But there are many, many leaders, and I think we're in an era where this is more common than not, where character is not really the major criteria so much as it is, can they maintain power for the party they're with?
And it certainly doesn't seem to matter to the electorate.
Not right now, not to many people who are voting.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank you both for a spirited conversation tonight. Thank you so much, Julian, for joining Westport Library tonight. Thank you all for watching at home. And thank you to the Westport League of Women Voters for working on this program with us. For those of you at home, remember that you can purchase a copy of Burning Down the House through 10 p.m. this evening. Excellent. The link is on the registration webpage, or you can borrow a copy from the library. Remember to watch westportlibrary.org for future and recorded events. And thank you both so much for your time. This was absolutely eye-opening. And Julian, we hope that your next book is just as good, and maybe we'll get you back in Westport.
That sounds terrific. Thank you.
Great. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you so much.